was normal.
The Old Church staff had already been warned by their Great Ormond Street colleagues that David's mother may have been tampering with his samples in order to produce the unusual readings. Neither team had firm evidence, but the theory was becoming stronger.
Gradually, the suspicions that arose in relation to Petrina Stocker began to ferment. That happened as a result of the observations of the nurses in relation to the samples that David was providing. It was not believed that the samples could be genuine.
One of the reasons was that he had an unduly prolonged illness, which could not be explained in spite of extensive investigations, and he been seen by various specialists, and all his tests were normal. One more important reason was that when round-the-clock surveillance was introduced, David actually became better in every way.
Over the next 4 days, the staff logged more strange occurrences in David's medical notes. His mother had presented them with a sample of his vomit, which they didn't think was real. David made a complaint that his Ribena drink tasted salty, and still more blood clots appeared in his urine samples. The Old Church staff, like those at Great Ormond Street, clearly had suspicions that Petrina was somehow involved. So why wasn't it treated more seriously?
If, as a doctor, as a paediatrician, you think a child is being harmed, or is at risk of being harmed, even if you haven't got proof, you've got a single duty. Your duty is to report what you know to the Social Services Department of the local authority, and the Children Act tells you you have to do that. It's then up to the Social Service Department to investigate the case. My experience in many of these cases is that investigations are inconclusive. At the end of the day, you just don't know.
It was hard for anyone to believe that a mother would harm her own son. But staff were coming increasingly to that conclusion. And so, it seemed, was David's father, Keith.
His father raised concerns about the source of blood in David's urine. He alleged that his wife was adding menstrual blood to his urine.
But why? According to Keith Stocker, his wife may have tampered with the urine samples to make it look like there was something wrong with them.
He later, it should be emphasised, withdrew that allegation upon seeing his son provide a sample of urine that had to have blood in it through a normal course rather than through any contamination.
But the damage was done. The fact that Petrina's own husband had made such serious allegations against her was seen by many to be highly significant.
Presumably, Mr. Stocker made the suggestion about his wife that she may have been contaminating these samples through the same desperation and frustration that she felt, that they were simply unable to get to the bottom of the illness, which of course was something they felt largely in common with the doctors who were looking after him.
After a meeting on the 5th of April, medical staff decided that David should receive one-on-one surveillance. Under a strict and watchful eye, his condition again improved.
David was allowed home on 9th of April. The consultant pediatrician who made the decision examined David that afternoon and found him happy, cheerful, and clinically fit to go home.
Oh, it was lovely to have him home. He seemed to get on well when he was home. One time when he was home, he was getting on quite well. He'd had his birthday and he wanted to spend his birthday money. So Mum and Dad took him out and bought him, I think, a Walkman and what he wanted. I think he wanted a camera. He's very interested in photography. They also bought him a hamster, and he got on very well at home.
David actually came to see us when he came out of hospital, and he was unfortunately in a wheelchair at that stage. David was really pleased to be there. He really obviously enjoyed the trip. I could tell that he did. We play a game which we call dodgeball, where we throw the ball at the children and they have to duck out of the way, and if they get hit they have to go and sit out, and we managed to include David in that.
But this happy time didn't last for long. After a rapid worsening of his condition in June 2001, David was readmitted to Old Church Hospital.
He continued to have some concerns with weight loss, feeling very weak, not being able to move and becoming wheelchair-bound, and also complaining of nausea, vomiting and pain abdomen.
It seemed to be a sickness that you never knew which way it was sort of going, you see, and then it was necessary, well, regretfully, we had to let him go back into the hospital because that's where the medical attention was.
The staff was shocked to see how ill David was looking. An Old Church paediatrician examined him, then referred him again to Great Ormond Street for further tests. And it was while he was undergoing them that doctors thought they'd made a breakthrough.
Those tests suggested that he had a rare and recently recognised reaction to a particular sort of infection, a streptococcal infection. Streptococcal infections are really quite common. They cause many sore throats, but occasionally a person will respond unusually.
Dr. Dale, a registrar at Great Ormond Street, was the doctor who finally came up with an idea to which the Stockers clung.
By this point, David Stocker had been ill for 7 months and been in and out of 2 hospitals. After the suspicions surrounding his mother, it seemed that doctors may have at last discovered what was wrong with him. But there were to be dramatic developments. Medical staff were to find out what had really gone on inside David's body.
Well, my first impressions of the case on reading the case notes was that David had been poisoned with salt. Nothing else seemed to fit. And what that will do is that essentially it will suck water out of the cells of the brain.
July 2001, David Stocker, now 9 years old, is in London's Great Ormond Street Hospital. He's been in and out of hospital for 7 months, and despite having an operation to remove his appendix, his condition is worsening. Paediatricians, dietitians and psychologists have all tried but failed to establish what's wrong. They remain concerned by inexplicable traces of blood in urine samples, and there are suspicions that his mother, Petrina, may be interfering in some way with his samples and with his drip. But now the Great Ormond Street doctors finally believe they've found out what is wrong with their young patient.
David was diagnosed as having PANDAS syndrome, which stands for Paediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorder, as a result of a streptococcal infection. It has a combination of effects, including affecting things like conscious level and mood, and causes various odd movements to occur. So it has a range of symptoms and signs. The clinicians obviously hoped, having pinpointed part of the problem at least, and starting him on treatment, that he would improve.
And that, of course, in turn, led to the obvious delight of the Stockers that they had finally found out what was wrong with him.
Petrina was very relieved. Obviously, she didn't want anything to be wrong with her little boy, but at least they'd found out. She was glad that they'd found out what was wrong with him, and now he could be treated.
Initially, David did improve and was allowed to go home. But the doctor's optimism proved to be misplaced.
And we had calls from his mother that he was unwell. He was losing weight, he was lethargic, he was vomiting, he was weak, and this time he was probably fitting as well.
With David's condition only getting worse, he was readmitted to Old Church Hospital on the 1st of August 2001. But within 24 hours, the doctors there decided he needed to be treated in London.
During David's second admission to Great Ormond Street, and when he didn't respond to the treatment which we would have expected to help with PANDAS, it became of greater concern, I believe, to the clinicians about whether something else was causing his problems, including whether the relatively minor events which we'd noticed before and had been noticed at Old Church might have been an indication that actually illness was being induced.
Once again, suspicion fell on David's mother. Was she somehow to blame for his condition?
It takes a long time for most of us, I think, to get suspicious, because what we're actually, if we do get suspicious, what we're actually saying is this person sitting in front of us, whom we've got to know over a period of time, and who presents as a perfectly normal, rather anxious mother, whom we haven't been able to help, is actually lying through her teeth.
On the 2nd of August 2001, The same day David had been admitted to Great Ormond Street, he suffered a cardiac arrest and slipped into a coma.
I visited David in Great Ormond Street Hospital twice, actually. The first time I'd been telephoned by Keith to say that David was actually in a coma, and that the coma was on a scale of 1 to 9. I think it was a 3, which is apparently not really deep in a coma. And I don't know whether he was aware that I was there or not. I spoke to him, I held his hand, and I just had a conversation with him, which obviously he couldn't answer or communicate with me.
David did come out of the coma, but he remained seriously ill and was unable to eat and drink normally.
David was being fed via a tube going into his nose and therefore required special feeds. When these feeds are made up, they're obviously not just a bottle of milk from the milkman. They are special feeds made up in our diet kitchen so that they contain the full amount of nutritional elements that a child of David's age would need to be able to maintain his weight and, if anything, put weight on.
Despite the feeds, David failed to gain weight. The nursing staff then decided to put him under closer supervision. This meant that there had to be at least one nurse watching David's bedside at all times. When his condition began to improve slightly, another suggestion was made: to move him to a rehabilitation psychiatric ward.
There were a combination of reasons why it was felt that he was ready to move to a rehabilitation ward. There were obviously concerns by that time that some of his symptoms were being induced, being caused by somebody else. And there were child protection issues raised, and the child protection procedure was followed through. In addition, David actually started to improve, and so the hope was that by going to a rehabilitation ward, then that improvement would continue.
On the 16th of August, the decision was made to transfer David to the Mildred Creek Psychiatric Unit at Great Ormond Street to begin rehabilitation. The move was scheduled to take place 4 days later, on August the 20th.
Mr. and Mrs. Stocker were obviously told of the plan to move David from the ward that he was on to a different ward, and they would have been told why that was felt necessary.
But on August the 18th, 2 days before the planned move, David's condition worsened. Both his mother and father were at his bedside.
I had a phone call from Petrina in the early hours of the morning. I think she was trying not to panic me, but trying to tell me to get to the hospital as quickly as we could, because David was very ill.
An examination by hospital staff revealed that David was severely dehydrated. Then, as they made efforts to treat him, he had a seizure. Further tests were carried out. These showed that the salt levels in the boy's body were extremely high. Normal blood contains around 140 millimoles of salt per litre, but in David's case the reading was 218 millimoles. Doctors were growing increasingly alarmed about his condition, and the efforts to treat him were becoming more frantic. As he began to lose consciousness, there was a desperate attempt at resuscitation, but he slipped into a second, deeper coma.
Well, when we got there, we realised how serious things were, and well, with Keith and Petrina there, we just threw our arms around them and tried to comfort them. They were so upset.
The next day, doctors faced two tasks: to reduce the excessive salt levels in David's blood and find out what had caused them.
We obviously looked at David's feeds after he collapsed, because a feed was going in at the time he did collapse. And when the feed was looked at, there were visible crystals which were thought to be salt in the feed.
Could these crystals finally explain the high levels of salt in David's blood?
There is no medical reason for additional salt to be added to the feeds. The feeds are complete and no added salt is required for them. Therefore, finding salt crystals in the feeds means that salt must have been added to the feeds by somebody.
Detectives at Hendon Police in North London were called in to investigate. Meanwhile, David's condition became critical.
I got into the hospital, and when I got there, David's grandmother, said to me that Keith and Petrina were actually in the office, and they were being told that they were going to switch the life support machine off.
On the 20th of August 2001, David died.